wanted, after Vish's lecture yesterday, I wanted to make a connection with what he said. So he talked about multiplicative noise and how multiplicative noise can give rise to interesting effect. And what I wanted to say is that what we saw yesterday can be written explicitly in terms of multiplicative noise. And so the first model, so birth and death model effectively can be written as x dot, well, let's write dx dt equal to some mu x plus square root of sigma c. And the second model, let's say environmental fluctuations, can be written in terms this way. Where this CT is the white noise that Vishu was talking about yesterday. So it's Gaussian mean zero with the delta correlated noise, and also here. And what you see is that these two models have, the deterministic part are the same. They are both exponential growth. And what changes is the shape of the noise. Right? So in both cases, the noise is multiplicative, which means that the amplitude of the noise depends on the state of the system, on the variable x. And in this case, square says the square root, the amplitude is proportional to the square root of x, but in this case, it's proportional to x. Okay? And this difference is what gives rise to the phenomenology that we discussed yesterday. So in this case, that there is a finite probability to go to zero and to go to extinction after some time, so that even if mu is positive, there is a fraction of trajectories that will go to zero. And in this case, that the average growth is different from the typical growth. Okay? So this just to make a connection. Questions? You can read, it's too small? Environmental fluctuations, yes. Okay, so this was, yes? So the point is, if you, the difference here is that, well, the implications is that you, let's say, what you would I mean, there are many implications, let's say, but what this means is that the average x, okay, in this case, grows as e to the mu t, if it's written in this way, okay. But if you take a trajectory, right, you simulate a trajectory, and you look at what is the limit of time going to infinity of x of t, this is okay. And actually one can show, not surprisingly, that the average of the log x is what converges to the typical one. Okay, and as we discussed yesterday, the point is that the trajectories of x are dominated by this very rare jackpot trajectory. Okay. Okay. This was to make a connection with what Vishu said yesterday. Other questions? Okay. So today, I mean, the title of I want to comment the title of today's presentation. So today I will discuss about neutral theory, and the sort of big title is wrong models in ecology. One, and in today's the title will be wrong models in ecology 2. And the idea is that the fact that there are wrong models in ecology is a feature, not a bug in some sense. And the point is that what I'll try to present are models that fail in predicting something, right? And failing in predicting something is the ability of the fact that there are models that can fail and that they fail. It's something that we should hope for a model. It's a good feature of a model because it means that can be falsified and we can learn something about the data in analyzing this model, as opposed to models that cannot be really proven wrong because perhaps they are so flexible that they can accommodate every possible things that can happen. Okay. So I want to start with the experience that we had. What happened? Ah, you have a question. Okay, I went forward, but you were still here. So no, it's like this, because this is different from what we wrote yesterday. So yesterday we were writing, well, we had another parameter that we didn't call mu. I don't remember anymore how we called, but the parameter that we wrote yesterday, so yesterday we wrote something like x of t is equal to, well, n, we were using n of t equal to n of 0 e to the rt plus square root of sigma t eta, okay? And these are, it's mu minus sigma square over 2, okay? So if you want to map it to, okay. In the notes, I'll put the mapping, so, yeah. Okay? So today's class, today's presentation is titled blah, blah, blah. No, yes, I mean, okay. And I want to start from the experience that we had last week, where we went into the forest behind the NCBS, and we look at what we had around, right? And what we saw is that there are many different types of plants and also non-plants that live together, right? And then, so this was 1 week ago, and then yesterday, this is a picture from Matthew's presentation. Matthew told us what ecologists typically do when they go into this kind of forest, right? So what they do is that at the end, they collect observation, they counting, they classify these different individuals. And what they obtain at the end is this kind of data, where we have different species, different samples, and then perhaps we have for each sample some characteristic of the environment. I don't know how much it rained, what is the pH of the soil, etc., 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 temperature, blah, blah, blah. And then for each species, we might characterize many different traits, how big is the plant, what is the size of the leaves, etc., etc. And this is somewhat that we were also trying to do, in the sense that the kind of observation that we are looking at was, okay, there is a lot of these species, and these species tend to have this size, and there are fewer of these other species that tend to have this other size, right? So at the end, what we can imagine to do with this observation to, let's say, quantify things is to get some of these kind of metrics. And of course, this matrix tends to be noisy in the sense that the entries varies a lot and tend to be sparse in the sense that perhaps a species that we find in one place is not found in the other. And so this was yesterday. And what we're going to do today and tomorrow is to forget about many things and to focus on this matrix and on the fact that this matrix tends to be noisy and sparse. Okay, so, and actually tomorrow is the day after tomorrow, but yeah. So this is our goal for these 2 days, and to even zoom even more in today, I'm gonna even do something simpler and forget about the fact that there are different samples, but saying, suppose that I have one sample and I collect these the abundances of different species. What can I say about these abundances? Okay, so this is, of course, I mean, there is a lot of black space here because it's like really reducing the problem to something where we lost information about many things that could be relevant. Okay, and so if we look at these kind of data where we reduced a lot and we basically counted how many individuals belong to a given species in a given sample, what we end up is a list of counts. So how many individuals belong to the species. And the first thing that you could do is to do, well, it's to try to look at how these numbers differ to each other. Right? And this was also discussed last week. And the very basic phenomenology, which is also something that we don't need really to count things to realize that, just going outside, is that there are many different things. So the number of things that is not zero in this column, it's large. I mean, it's not that we see just one species, at least if we go outside this building. And the other thing is that there are many different species, and there are common species and rare species, right? Species don't tend to have all the same abundance, but we have a wide range of abundances. So this is a very basic phenomenology that people realized a long time ago. And one can try to make the observation more quantitative and basically look at the histogram of these abundances, right? And since these abundances are very wide in their distribution, what one can do is to look at this histogram in log scale. So when you look at the log abundances and you count how many individuals have how many species have a given log abundance, right? So this, for instance, is a very famous, I think we saw it also last week. So this is a very famous, the most famous island among ecologists yes, in the world. This island is in Panama. It's called Barro Colorado Island. And what happened is that people for several years, every 5 years, were counting and classifying every tree with a diameter above 1 centimeter, I think, or 10 centimeters, 10 centimeters in this plot, so in this area, right? So it's 300,000 trees, I believe, so it's a lot of counting. But every 5 years, they were like counting and classifying, okay? And so what you have is that what you see is this pattern, very simple, of common and rare species. So you have species that are rare. You have many species here that are rare. And then you have a few species, one species that is very common, right? That has more than 2,000 individuals, okay? And people said, okay, we collect this data, we see this histogram. Why do we have this histogram? Right? So what are the mechanisms or what are the processes that we need to include to explain this variability, right? Of course, the simplest model that you can imagine is a model where every species have the same abundance, right? And that model clearly fails. So you need some process that creates this diversity in abundances. So how do we do that? Okay. So sometimes, just for reference, because we saw that in a different, yes?
Maybe I'm stating an obvious point, but would you care to maybe spend 30 seconds talking about the x-axis, the scale of the x-axis of this part, just because just looking at this, it seems small, a small amount of variation, but just seeing that you want to
exactly. So this is in, as I said, is in log scale. So this means that, yeah, that this is the number of species that have 1 individuals, and this is the number of species that have 2,000 individuals, right? And this variability might be more easily observable in the next slide, where this is another way to show the same variability, where you say, I look at what fraction, what percentage of the relative abundance is captured by the most abundant species, and so on, right? So this point here, it says that the most abundant species has 10% of the individuals, okay? And then what you see is that you have a few species that are very abundant, but then you have many, many species that are very rare. Okay? So these, if you want this plot here, if you flip it like this, is the cumulative distribution of this plot. Okay? Is it clear? And we saw those plots last week in Gaurav talks. Okay? Questions? Okay, you can repeat the observation not just in Barro Colorado Island, which is the one that we saw. And here the x-axis is basically the log2 value of the abundance. But we can repeat it for different tropical forests, and somewhat we observe a similar shape of this distribution. Okay. And then people look at this distribution also in other systems other than tropical forest, and you see something. I mean, you see differences, but overall, the first picture that emerged is something similar to what I showed you before. Okay. So the question here, where people started asking actually a long time ago, is what is the minimal mechanism? How do we that can capture this variability? Right. This is a somewhat clear phenomenology. Okay. We observe that. We observe that in different forests. We observe that in different systems. So we can imagine that if you observe a general phenomenology, there could be general or common mechanisms that determines these shapes. Okay. I don't remember. I think these are different, might be different models or different fits, but here the point is that I cared about are the data. Okay. Okay. Questions? Other questions? Okay, so what I want to do today is to describe what has been a very influential way to answer this question, which is called neutral theory, which is, let's say, a set of models with very strong assumption on the processes that determine species abundance. And what I want to do is to do a sort of derivation or explain you what are the ingredients of this model, and then show you what are the predictions. Okay. So what we're going to do now is to switch to the board. Okay. So the main assumption of neutral theory, and this is the sort of the strong assumption that led to a lot of controversy and criticisms, is that all the species are equivalent. What does it mean that all the species are equivalent? What it means is that there is no difference in species birth, that all the individuals have the same birth and death rates. Okay? So that somehow different species are different just because of stochasticity, right? That if you take an individual from one species or an individual from another species, they have exactly the same probability of giving birth or dying. Okay, so this is, of course, a very strong assumption, and it puts all the variability into the variability due to stochasticity. Okay. So, okay. Okay. So the neutral theory is typically divided or formulated in considering the same time or considering two sort of coupled systems. So the idea that stems for the sort of long tradition of biogeography in ecology is that if you observe a local community, so if you go around and you look at a forest in a given area, that is not a closed system, clearly. It's a system that is coupled by a migration to another system, okay? So the idea is that you have actually, when you consider a local, let's say, the focal system, the system you're studying, which is often called the local community, that is actually coupled to another community, which is often called the meta-community, okay? And somehow is coupled by via migration. So the idea is that there is, let's say, local community, which could be a patch in a forest. In the classical example is an island, right? And somehow this local community, it's coupled by migration to a much bigger meta-community. And this meta-community could be the continent, if you're thinking of an island, could be the set of RL islands, if you are considering an archipelago, could be the area around your local community, if you are considering an extensive system, okay? And the idea here, when you consider, let's say, this coupling is that the dynamics of the meta-community, I mean, that this migration, it's small, and the local community is much smaller than the meta-community, so you can separate these two. So you can study the meta-community, which is not affected by the dynamics in the local community, okay? And then the dynamics of the local community satisfies the dynamics internal, and then plus migration, which depends on the abundances in the meta-community, okay? So what I'm gonna do now is to write two models. The first model is a model for the meta-community, and then I'll write a model for the local community coupled to the meta-community, okay? Questions?
Is the meta-community not affected by the migration?
The meta-community is not affected by migration from the local community because the idea is the meta-community is much bigger than the local community, so the migration from the local community is not relevant, okay? So if you want, you can imagine that the meta-community is a closed system and the local community is an open system coupled to the meta-community, okay? Okay, so let's start from meta-community. And the idea here is, in the simplest version, this is very simple to the model we wrote yesterday. So the idea is that there are many species, okay? And all these species have the same, as I say, they are ecological equivalent. So they all have the same rate of birth and death, okay? Now, to start with that, we can imagine that there are M species, okay? And there are basically two processes. So if you focus on a given species, the number of individuals in this species can decrease by 1 if one of these individuals dies, okay? And then what you have is that you have n plus 1, okay? And n plus 1, it's a birth rate, but then there is something more that can happen. So the idea is you can also have mutations, right? And so you can have mutations or speciation, and when you have these events, what happens is that you become another species, okay? So this number of M species, if you want, represent all the possible diversity you could possibly have, and then we're gonna take this M to infinity very soon, okay? So the idea is that you increase by 1 if you give birth times 1 minus this mutation or speciation rate in this context, okay? But then you can also increase by 1 if an individual from another species mutates, okay? And so this happens with a rate which is nu over m times n minus m, well, times p prime. Okay? Questions? Is this clear, the set? Yeah? Capital N, sorry. This is the total number of oh, sorry, it's too small. Is the total number of individuals. Okay, so it's the total number of individuals that you have in the meta community. M is the total number of potential species that you have in the meta community. So it's not the ones that are present. Some could have zero abundance, but it's like the maximum diversity which you can possibly have. This term, this second term represents the fact that if there are mutations, right? And here we are imagining a very simple scenario where these mutations actually correspond, you can basically mutate into a new species, okay? So you should not think of this as a point mutation, of course, right? It's like right? The idea is that another way in which you can increase by one, if you have an individual of another species, right? So this is the number of individuals of other species, give birth, mutates, and mutates exactly into the species we're focusing on, okay? Because when you mutate, you can mutate in one of the M species, and then this is the probability that mutate exactly in that one, okay? Yes, because then I'm gonna absorb that in B. It's just a notation because I'm gonna forget about V prime very soon, okay? Now, what I said is this M represent all the possible species that we have that could possibly exist. So M is not large, it's really, really large. So we're gonna send immediately M to infinity, okay? So we're gonna send immediately M to infinity, and I will rewrite this rate. So I will write B equal to B prime 1 minus nu, okay? So let me, yes. And this term will be B n. Now, if M is very large, this number is always very small, right? The point is this number is always very small, except if this term is 0, right? When this term is 0, this term counts, okay? Because in that case, this term gives a these terms, which it's n minus, will be n, sorry, n B prime over M delta n 0, okay? So this term, we're gonna consider it only if the species is absent, okay? This is basically to say that if the species is present, this term doesn't play any role. Okay. Now, what one can do is, as we did yesterday, to write the equation for P n T T equal to dot dot dot, exactly in the same way that we wrote yesterday. Okay. Now, in this case, the question we want to ask is that, okay, this process, we will have a dynamics. What we want to know is, well, actually, let me write this because it's useful. So this is going to be d m plus 1 p m plus 1 t plus b n minus 1 plus this other term n minus 1 minus the dn plus bn plus nu n b prime m delta n0 p of nt, okay?
So when we take n is very large, shouldn't n also become super?
We will see it later what, okay? But the point is, even if m is very large, right? Now, we can neglect this term whenever this term is non-zero, okay? But we cannot neglect in general when this term is non-zero, right? Okay. So, and as I said yesterday, so this is just to recap, this is the rate at which you go from n plus 1 to n. This is the rate at which you go from n minus 1 to n. And this is Wn and n minus 1. And this is Wn n plus 1. Okay? Yes? No, because this is not the number of species that there are many species which have 0 individuals. Okay? We're going to see that in a second. Okay? So this M is not the number of species that exist in the meta community, is the number of species that could potentially exist. Okay? Basically, what we are doing when we take this M to be very large is that we are saying every time you have this speciation event, you have a new species, right? Which is obvious. Okay, so so what we want to know is that, okay, we have this equation. The question we are interested in is what happens for large times. Okay, so if we look at large times, what is going to happen to this probability distribution? And what you can show is that in this case, actually, this probability distribution converge to what is called a stationary distribution. So it converges to some distribution which is well defined. Okay, and how do we find this distribution? Okay, well, we have a dynamic equation which describes the change in time of the probability, and we want to know, and we have a first order equation of this probability in time, and we want to find the large time limit of this of the solution. How do we going to find these things? Ideas? You could do that, but yes, that we use that to find the time solution. But in this case, so if you have an equation like x dot, well, dx dt equal to f of x, and I ask you, what is the limit for time going to infinity of x of t? How do you find it? One way is to do the solution and then take the limit, but we typically don't do this. If I say that this limit is some x star. Yes, so what you do to find this f star is that under some conditions, but which applies here, but the large time limits, okay, of the trajectory converge to this fixed point. And what is a fixed point? Is a point where f of x star is equal to 0. Okay, so here it's the same, right? The large time limits, this is going to converge to some value, and this value is the value where this term, the derivative, is equal to 0. Okay? Questions about this? Now, when you have this kind of when you have master equation stochastic process, there are like some conditions under which this limit exists, and that makes this probability existing, but we are not going to discuss that now. In this case, it applies. Okay, so this limit is well defined, and in order to find this solution, what we have to find is to put the right-hand side equal to 0. Okay, and so in this case, what we have is an equation that looks like this. N minus 1, 2, oof, n minus 1, n p star of n minus 1 minus w of n plus 1 p star of n minus w n minus 1 p star of n equal to 0. Okay? Can you? Yeah. So we gain more space. Yes?
Is capital N a parameter of the model, or is it a time-dependent model?
In principle, it's a time-dependent quantity, but I'm gonna comment on that soon. Okay? So
This equation is valid for all the species.
exactly. So in principle, this n, includes the. In principle, it's a time-dependent quantity. Now I'm gonna think it is a parameter, and then I'll justify it later. Let's do this. Okay. So what I have here is that I have this equation that I have to solve. Okay. So I'll comment back on that. But for now, let's assume this is constant. It's not constant, but let's assume it's constant. So what I have is that this equation can be written as n plus 1 to n p star of n plus 1 minus w n sorry, let me check that because I don't want to do something stupid. N plus 1 p star of n equal to w n minus 1 p star of n minus w n minus 1 n p star of n minus 1. Okay, when I just rearrange the terms this way, and then I can call this term j star of n plus 1, this term j star of n. Okay, because you see that these terms is, it's exactly the same when I substitute n minus 1 to every n. Okay, and so the equation we get is j star of n plus 1 equal to j star of n. And what is the solution of this equation? The solution of this equation is j star, in principle, equal to a constant. Okay. But now, what you can realize is that if you look at what happens in j star of 0, right? In j star of 0, what you have is that you have the rate at which you go from 0 to minus 1, which is 0, minus the rate at which you go from minus 1 to 0, which is 0. So we see that at the boundaries, this is equal to 0. Okay, which implies that all of these are equal to 0. Okay, and so if you do that, what you discover is that you have that w n plus 1 to n p star of n plus 1, it's equal to w n plus 1 p star of n. Okay, and then this equation, it's easy to solve because then what we get is p star of n is equal to the product from I going to 0 to n minus 1 of w I plus 1 over W I I minus 1, I believe. Let's check. Not written this way. I minus 1 to I to I minus 1, product from 1, well, probably was correct, but 1 to n times p star of 0. Okay? So what I did is just iterating this. Okay? So I take the pn star n plus 1, it's equal to this here, and then you iterate this expression until you arrive to 0. Okay? Questions?
How do you get a J star 0?
How?
J star 0.
The J star, how that this is 0? Well, because if you look at here, the definition of J star, here you get that you have the rate of going from 0 to minus 1, which is 0. And then the rate to go from minus 1, well, and then you have the probability of minus 1, which is 0. Okay? Yes. How do I get this one? Because you can see that in this expression, J star of n plus 1 is equal to J star of n for any n. So it means that it has to be a constant, independent of n. And then we discover that is equal to 0. Okay?
The constant part is clear, but
The y equal to 0 is because J star of 0 in particular is equal to 0, so they all have to be equal. Now, opening a parenthesis, which for some of you might be interesting, the fact that I can say this, it's a very special condition. It's what makes us very lucky, and is because there is, in this case, what is called detailed balance, which makes our life easy. So if you know about this, you can map it. If you don't know about this, you don't have to worry in this context. Okay, so this is basically the solution up to the fact that we have to determine what is p star of 0. Okay? So, well, it's almost a solution, except we didn't substitute the terms, but that's fairly easy. So what is, so we have the denominator and the numerator. So we have the product of I going from 1 to n of w I minus 1 to I, which is so it's I minus 1 to I, which I can write as the product from 0 to n minus 1 of w I to I plus 1, which is what we wrote there. So this is going to be the product. Well, it's going to be determine 0, which is nu over m b prime times n times the product from I to n minus 1 of b I, and this is equal to b to the n minus 1 times n minus 1 factorial. And then you have the product from I to n of w I minus 1, which is equal to the product I from I to n of di, which is d to the n factorial. So if you put these things together, you get p star of n equal to p star of 0, nu n b prime over m b over d to the n 1 over n. Okay? So this is almost the solution, except, and this is like algebra, you don't have to follow, it's in the notes. It's almost the solution, except we have to decide what is P0. Right? How we decide what is P0? P star 0 is the extinction probability, but how do we fix it here?
Normalize.
Hmm?
Normalize the probability.
By normalization, right? So this expression, it's valid for n larger or equal than 1. So what you get is that you have that 1 has to be equal to P star 0 plus the sum I from 1 to, well, in principle, infinity, P star I. Okay? And this becomes P star of 0 times 1 plus nu n b prime over m, the sum from 1 to infinity of b over d to di 1 over I. Okay? Then you can calculate this. And the bottom line is that what you discover is that P star of 0, it's 1 over 1 minus 1 plus something that depends times something else. Okay? Now, if we assume that the number of possible species that you have, m, is much larger than 1, this is telling us that this P star of 0 is very close to 1. Okay? So basically you have these many potential species that you could possibly have, but you see a small fraction of them. Okay? Okay. So in general, now, typically you don't focus on the species that don't exist, but you focus on the species that do exist. So you focus on the species that have an abundance in the meta community larger or equal than 1. Okay. And so what you know is that, well, I can rewrite this as some theta, which is this combination of parameters. Yes.
So n, little n goes up to capital N, right? Or this go up to
Little n, okay. Yes, in principle, okay. So here there is the point where there is the simplification. So in principle, we should assume that it goes to capital N. Capital N, it's like a variable that corresponds to the sum of all these individuals. The idea is you will not have that a single species will take all the individuals, so I can approximate this sum as a sum up to infinity. Okay? So in some sense, we are in a regime where m is much larger than, so we want to be in a regime where this is true. Okay? Okay, and the number and the typical abundance n is much smaller than the total abundance. Okay, so this is the regime where we're gonna put ourselves in. Okay, and so you can approximate this sum as a sum to infinity. Okay, now what we focus on is, yes, m is the total number of potential species you could possibly have, and we say this is like incredibly large. Okay, so basically this is just saying every time you introduce a new species is a new species. Because otherwise this, because you want because I think otherwise you will not have, actually it's not perhaps necessarily needed. Sorry?
By writing down W and U plus 1, you consider only B.
Yes, but this is just that small n, it's bigger than capital N. Yeah, I'm not sure about it. Let's go back to that later. Yeah, I'm not sure about this. Let's put a question mark. Okay. Yes.
So if B was a little larger than B, that sum wouldn't converge.
Yes, that's true. So this one converges only if D is larger than B. Okay. Otherwise, this will diverge. That's correct.
Just about the previous, about the M example, if M were not much larger than N, then the second term could contribute even when
That's true. That's exactly true. Thank you. Yes, good point. So we want this term to be small, okay? And for that term to be small, we need to have this condition. Okay? And also we are in the case where this is true. Okay, so what we care about at the end is how many species have some abundance n, okay? And we care about the species that have abundance larger than 1 or equal to 1. So what is the number of species with the expected number of species with abundance n? The expected number of species with abundance n, it's equal to the total number of species you could possibly have times the probability that they have this abundance. Okay? So if we put these things together, what we get here is that this quantity, right, just multiplying this by n, by m, this quantity is equal to some theta, let's say x to the n over n, okay? Where in this case, theta is equal to P0 times nu times n times b prime, and x is equal to the ratio of the birth and the death rate. Okay? So what we obtain here is that we have an expression for the number of species with abundance n, which is exactly the thing we were plotting. Okay? And if you look at how this looks like, this is something that decreases monotonically. Okay? With n. Now, from this expression, what we can calculate is what is the total number of species in the meta community simply by summing from 1 to infinity this S of n. Okay, and we can calculate the expected number of individuals in the community by calculating the sum n plus 1 to infinity of n S of n. Okay. Now, the important point of all this game, right, is that you see that I was talking about n species, but I wrote the equation for only one species, right? And there is no dependency anywhere on species identity, right? So the important point here is that all the species are equivalent, meaning that they have the same birth and death rate. But the fact that they are equivalent, since there is stochasticity, does not imply that they have the same abundance, right? So if you want, all the species abundance are independently, the species abundance are identically distributed, but are independent extractions, right? So if you have a distribution and you draw two numbers, they are typically different, right? Okay.
X is b by d. X is b by d.
Yes. So X says yes. So you can see the connection, okay? And then you can express the total number of species and then in terms of this theta and X, but this is not particularly now. Okay, so this is what happens in the meta community. So let's say I'll keep it like here. So what we have is that we know that in the meta community, this is what we expect, okay? And then we will have some parameters, theta and X, which can be related to these more fundamental parameters as we saw. Now, what we have to do, and I will not do it all the calculation, but what we can do is to focus on the local community, right? So what happens in the local community?
So this calculate those are finite.
Yeah, they are all finite. Yes. So you can see that both this total number of species and these ones are finite. So this, if I remember correctly, it's theta x 1 minus x, and this is theta log 1 minus x. Okay. Questions? Good. So, okay, so what is the dynamics of the local community? Well, the dynamics of the local community is basically similar to the one of the meta community, but what we are assuming here is that there is also a fixed number of individuals. Okay, let's call it J. There is a fixed number of individuals, and basically what can happen is that you can only reproduce if another individual dies. So you have somewhat saturated space, right? And so the probability to go from n to n plus 1 is the probability that an individual of a different species dies, and then you reproduce. Okay? And similar, the probability of dying, it's n over j, and then an individual of another species reproduces. Okay? Now, this will be the dynamics if you didn't have a coupling with the meta community. Okay? So the idea is you are in a local community, all the space is occupied, and when one individual dies, it's replaced by another one taken at random. But now the idea is that you have also migration. So sometimes when an individual dies, it's not replaced by an individual of another species, but it's replaced by an individual of another species with a probability 1 minus m, where m is the migration probability. Okay? And so here you have another term, which is the migration term. And so when an individual dies, with probability m is replaced by one individual of the meta community. And let's say that you have to ask of which species. Well, it's replaced, sorry, this species replaced by an individual, this place increases when the individual migrating is of the same species. Okay? And that probability, this is the relative abundance in the meta community. Okay? So what you're saying is the way you can increase by 1 is either if you reproduce or if an individual of the same species migrate from the meta community. Okay? And the probability that the one individual migrating from the meta community is of your species is proportional to the relative abundance in the meta community. Okay? And then here, yes. Yes, Y depends on the species. That's correct. So if you want, I can put a label here where I have an I, right? And everything depends on I. Okay, but I will not do that later. But this is the relative abundance of species I. Okay, yes.
And J represents the
total number of individuals in the local community, which is fixed. Okay. Now, for this, in the same spirit, here you can write that this term is going to be plus n I over j times m 1 minus yi. Okay. So in this case, another way to decrease is if you die, and then the individual migrating is of a different species. Okay, because 1 minus y is the probability that if you pick an individual at random from the meta community, is from a different species of I. Okay. Yes.
J is for local community or meta?
Local community. Okay. So yi is that n is the value of n of that species over the abundance in the meta community. Okay. So now this is the definition of the model, and basically you can do the same that we did up to this solution here, right?
Why isn't there a G factor there?
There is no D, because in this case you say, what you're saying is, well, in principle you could have a rate, but here you say in the local community you have a finite space, okay? And this matters a lot in the local community. I mean, in principle, you could consider also in the meta community, but in the local community, you say you are constrained by the number of individuals, right? So the only way you can change is if one individual dies, okay? So in principle, you can imagine that there is a rate in front, but the rate here is the same for all these processes, because anything that can happen has to follow a death, okay? So if the rate, in principle, you could have a factor here which determines a time scale. But then since we are interested in the stationary distribution, that time scale will not matter.
What about birth and death in the local?
No, these are not different, right? Because you are saying the rate at which I mean, all the individuals are equivalent, all the species are equivalent, and the only way you can have a birth is if another individual dies.
But I think you should be of a different species. But
yes, but all of them, they have the same rates, right?
Okay, could you just explain the first term again?
Yes. So the first term is how do you go from n to n minus 1? So you die, an individual of another species reproduces.
So you die means y ni by j?
Yes, the probability, you take an individual at random and you kill it, right? What is the probability that if you take an individual at random belongs to this species? That's exactly ni over j. Then another individual reproduces. And the other individual reproduces with a probability that is, I mean, with probability 1 minus m, another individual reproduces. And with probability m, an individual from the meta community migrates.
So there is an implicit assumption that the time scale here is the typical
Death.
birth and death time of an individual.
Yes, if you want, you can say everything here, it's multiplied by some time scale 1. Okay? And now this time scale 1 over tau, you can see immediately that when you write this solution here, simplifies. Right? Not surprisingly, because the stationary distribution does not depend on the time scale. Okay? So this time scale will just tell me if this process happens in seconds, in hours, in years, but then it doesn't affect the stationary distribution. Okay?
When you're dead, you're being replaced by a different species. Right?
Yes.
That's the second term.
Yes. Yeah.
The first one shouldn't you be replaced by some
Yes, it's this term here. Because you die and another individual reproduces. Okay?
So there is an implicit assumption that J is constant or something.
Yes, J is constant.
So is that a fair assumption? Or a local?
You say all the space it's like saturated, and all the individuals are competing for that for one. So the idea here in neutral theory, the idea is that there is one common resource that is sort of limiting everyone. Okay.
But even so, I mean, is it fair to allow for fluctuations in the total population of the local?
You can. I mean, actually, you can, and it doesn't change much what you obtain. I mean, if you assume that on average is fixed, then I mean, there are many works showing that it doesn't change. I mean, actually, historically, also people like modeling the meta community were assuming that this number of individuals is fixed, but it doesn't change much, actually.
J is not fixed. Does the order matter?
If J is not fixed, you have to change the model. Okay. Because you have to allow for it to fluctuate. In this way, it doesn't fluctuate. Okay. Okay. So what you get here is that you get some distribution up to this point, which I'll not write. But the key point is that the distribution you will get is a distribution which is conditioned so what you get is a distribution of n, which now is conditioned on the value of y. Okay? So what you get is you are solving for this process, and this process depends on the parameters, in particular depends on y, which is species dependent. Okay? Right? And y represents the abundance in the meta community. Okay? So what you can obtain at that point is that if you want to obtain the number of species with abundance n in the local community, this is going to be equal to, well, in principle, you should say this should be proportional to p star of n y. But actually, this y depends on the species, right? Because it corresponds to the species in the meta community. So this is going to be equal to the sum of, I mean, so the number of species with abundance n, right, depends on what is the probability of having n condition on the fact that the abundance in the meta community was k, times the number of species with abundance in the meta community equal to k. Okay? Yes.
We do all of this the same way as.
Yes, it says before. There is, I mean, it's a little bit more. It's written in the notes, but it's like, yeah, it's the same idea. Okay, so you get this expression here, which is exactly what you want, right? And so this expression depends on what parameters? It depends on these theta and x, which are properties of the meta community, and then it depends on the migration rate and j, which you can actually absorb in an individual parameter. Okay? So this is the idea of how to derive a prediction for that. Okay? And so the idea is that there are these processes, and the heterogeneity that you see in the species comes from this stochasticity, which is sort of coupled with the stochasticity in the meta community. Okay. Can I project? Questions about this? Okay. So the condition probability is that No, I mean, I can say it without. So the conditional probability is that you are writing what is the probability of having n individuals in the local community given k individuals in the meta community. Okay, and so the number of species that you will have with abundance n, right, is the probability that you have n species when there are k in the meta community summed over the number of species with k. Okay. Good. Okay. So then you take this model, which is a model that doesn't satisfy the bottom-down condition because it has 3 parameters. So I don't remember what is the grade for that. C. Yeah. So, but this model is, let's say, flexible enough to reproduce the shape of abundance distributions that you see in tropical forests. So it sort of naturally captures this distribution, and you can also so this work, what it does is that basically instead of considering a local community coupled to a meta community, considers a set of islands which are all coupled to themselves, and you obtain a prediction for what you observed in coral reefs.
Is there a closed form expression in this SIO? Is there a closed form expression?
Yes. I mean, well, it's in terms of it's like an integral. Okay. So you basically, this model does a good job in reproducing this piece of abundance distribution, right? Then you can say, okay, can I push it a little further? And then people try to do this. So before I move on, also because we have 10 minutes, questions on what we have seen so far? Yes.
How was stochasticity coupled in the equation? I got a bit confused on that.
How stochasticity?
Got coupled in the equation.
It's not that coupled in the equation. The point is that when you write this expression here, right, you see that these rates depends on this number, and this number is a random variable, right? It's stochastic. It depends on the realization in the meta community. Okay. Other questions?
Why neutral theory? By the name neutral.
Why neutral? Because you assume that the idea is that you are assuming that all the differences that you see. So if you go around, if I go back to the pictures we first saw, you see that individuals are different, right? You have trees, you have grass, so they appear to be different. The reason of why it's called neutral is because you are sort of assuming that these differences are neutral. What it means that they're neutral? It means that they don't affect the birth and the death rate. Right? All these species are equivalent. They have the same, in this model, they have the same birth and death rate. Okay? Yes.
Should we be surprised that it works like this? That these.
Yeah, I wanted to comment at the end of I wanted to. Yeah. So, but this is so. Yes.
Sort of along similar lines, like trying to get inclusion for how is that we assume that species are equivalent, but we get these different relative abundances that are able to recreate the species distributions. Just could you please provide more intuition for that?
So the point is, so this is so if you, let's say, the reason why so the point is that when you go around and you see species with different abundances, you could say, okay, one approach to this is to say this abundance that I observe reflects some underlying process, which is sort of important and has a biological relevance, right? This is a alternative, a complete alternative to all of this, and this says, no, there are differences, but these don't matter. Let's assume that these don't matter. Can I get differences in abundance? And this shows that stochasticity, and in this case, demographic stochasticity, can produce very large difference in abundances. Okay? Can produce very large difference in abundances without the need of invoking any particular mechanism. Okay, that simply by birth, death, and migration, you can produce like this very wide distribution of abundances. Okay. Now the point is that in some sense this is not a fully satisfying answer, because you can say, okay, but this is enough, but I mean, can we add more evidences, right? So yeah.
So do you get that in birth in natural systems?
So the point is, now, what is birth and death in this context? Birth and death in this context are effective parameters, right? Which capture the fact that you have many mechanisms that determines the birth and death. The idea is that in general, and this is true even if you consider logistic growth, you need to have that there is some regime in which the death balances the birth, right? Otherwise, you will have exponential growth. Okay.
Yeah. So, you showed this agreement with the experimental data, empirical data. The parameters of this model, and to get that agreement, you fitted the parameters to get the agreement, right? But could these parameters be independently measured?
Yeah, so people discuss a lot of this. There are, I mean, it becomes a little bit fuzzy, right? It doesn't really, it's complicated, especially the real problem of this, it's estimating what was that speciation term. That mutation rate, speciation rate, it really goes off in predicting what. I have a slide on this, right? So yeah, but other questions?
Just to clarify what's going on. So we have a meta population, we have a local population. In the meta population, stochastic fluctuations can lead to some species having higher abundances than others. And this drives the distribution of species in the local population.
Yes, I mean, it sums, I mean, also in the local population, you have fluctuations due to stochasticity, but sort of this creates a larger difference of abundances, right? And because so then
it would mirror what was in the meta population. You would have a similar distribution of
no, you have a different distribution.
No, what I mean is if a species is the most abundant in the meta population, it will also.
It's more likely to be, yes. So they are correlated, but they are not equal.
And this does not take into account cases where the local population has species that don't exist in the meta population.
No. The idea is that new species only emerge in the meta community. Okay, so I have 5 minutes and I will not be able to finish, but what I think I can do is to go through the other, or at least some of the things that, well, I will show you a couple of things that neutral theory reproduces well, and then what I'm going to do next time is to start again from this point and conclude this, okay? So one thing that you can do, which goes beyond sort of the stationary distribution, is try to study properties of the dynamics, okay? So what you can do is to ask, if today I see this number of trees of this species, what is the probability that in 5 years I'm going to see a different numbers, okay? And so this is related to what is called the stationary distribution, so really to the probability of having n individuals at time t, given that at time t minus 5 years I had a different number, okay? And in particular, what one can look at is what is the ratio of their abundance, right? At what factor they increase or decrease. So you can imagine if I have of what percentage the number of individuals increase or decreased. And what you get is that you get a distribution in the data which has these strong tails, and the distribution you get from this model captures well this distribution here. Okay, so you get something in the dynamics which looks similar. Another things you can do, still on the dynamics, is to ask, suppose that I have some time series, and I observe in a local community, in a patch. I observe a species for a while, and then I don't observe anymore, right? So what happens in this model is that in this model, you have a community, and then species change in their abundance. They can go locally extinct, but then migration can bring them back. Okay, and what you see when you look at this distribution is that the time scale, the lifetime of a species in the local community, has this power law tail. Okay, with some exponent, and what you get from neutral theory is that the distribution of the length of survival of these species has the same shape. Okay. So another thing you can do is to look at space. So how do you put space here? Well, what you can do is that you assume that basically species, when they reproduce, they randomly diffuse. Okay, so that simply they reproduce with some kernel. So when one individual dies here, it's replaced at random by one individual in some radius around that area. Okay, and here what you get is some data of the probability that two individuals belong to the same species when taken at random at a given distance. Okay, this distribution decreases, and you get a prediction for you get naturally a prediction from neutral theory, which produces these two scales. Okay. Another thing that you can do is to study how the number of species increases where you increase the area, right? So suppose that I go in my backyard and I count how many species of birds I have, and I see, okay, I saw 3 species, right? And then I increase these, and I go to larger and larger area. What you see is that you have these 3 sort of trends. So when you are at very small area, it increases linearly, because basically every time you see a new individual, so increasing the area, you collect new individuals. It's quite likely that as you see a new individual, you see a new species. But as you go up, you are basically collecting always the same species, right? So this level off. So it becomes more and more rare to find new species. But then if you travel a very large range, you see completely different species. And so these start to increase again. Okay? And you can reproduce these trends again with a very simple model where the only ingredients is diffusion, which creates basically areas when species are localized. Okay? Yes.
There's something to retain with that about the previous slide in terms of this probability of finding.
Yes. Yeah, it's sort of the same, a similar pattern in some sense, right?
Yeah, no, what I meant is that we are used maybe the rank abundance, you know, is there something that we learn about this probability of fitting to individuals and being connected?
I mean,
just something that you can measure and see.
No, I mean, the difference is that if you have a well-mixed situation, this is equivalent to, it's a property of the rank abundance, right? It's related to basically the second moment. But this is done in space. So it's how the probability of observing 2 individuals of the same abundance change with their distance. So I take 2 individuals that are, I don't know, 50 kilometers apart. What is the probability that they are the same species? Okay, so it's not as, if this was a well-mixed system, it will be trivial. I mean, trivial, it will be related to that. Okay, so this is the point, and then at this point, I'll stop. And so I'll talk about the things that neutral theory does well, and then next style I'll start from this point. So how this prediction can fail. Okay, questions?